112 years ago, in a four-story building on a river street in upstate New York, a fire alarm rang out across a factory floor. 111 workers heard it. Most of them did not move. They had heard it dozens of times before. 18 minutes later, the building was gone. 31 people were dead, and the cause of the fire was never officially determined. This is the story of the deadliest day in the history of Binghamton, New York, and one of the most important industrial disasters America has ever chosen to forget. If this story is new to you, stay until the end, because what happened inside that building and what happened after changed the way every workplace in this country is built. Like and subscribe, follow along, and do not go anywhere, because the thing that makes this story extraordinary is not the fire. It is everything that comes after it. Binghamton in 1913 was not the kind of place people think of when they imagine the setting for a tragedy. It was not a desperate city. It was not a city in decline. It was a city at the height of something that felt, to the people living it, like the beginning of everything good. Binghamton sits in the southern tier of New York State, where two rivers meet. The Susquehanna and the Chenango come together right at the heart of the city, and in the early 20th century, those rivers were flanked by factory after factory, producing things the country needed and employing thousands of people who had come from very far away to make that possible. The city had earned a nickname that locals used without irony, the Valley of Opportunity. It was not a small town, it was not a quiet place. It was a city at the peak of its industrial power, with rail connections to New York City, a growing middle-class, elaborate estates built by businessmen who called it the Parlor City, and streets full of people who had crossed an ocean to be there. Between the 1880s and the early 1900s, waves of immigrants arrived from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Hungary, and across Central and Eastern Europe. They came because the jobs were real, the factories were hiring. One of the largest employers in the region, the Endicott Johnson Shoe Company, had built an entire philosophy around the idea that a happy worker was a productive one. Its owner, George F. Johnson, offered wages among the highest in the industry, low-cost housing for employees, community recreational facilities, and a personal relationship with his workforce that was unlike anything else in American manufacturing at the time. The city around his factories had quite literally been renamed after him. In Binghamton in 1913, there was a prevailing sense that this was a place where labor and ownership had reached something like an understanding. For a young immigrant woman in that city, a factory job was not a fallback. It was independence. It was a fixed address and a steady wage at a time when neither was guaranteed. You woke up before dawn, you dressed, you walked to Wall Street, and you sat down at a sewing machine. You were paid by the piece, meaning every garment you finished added to what you took home that week. The faster you worked, the more you earned. You knew the women beside you by their first names. You ate lunch together. Some of you had been doing this for decades. Some of you were 16 years old and had been in this country for less than a year. You were sitting beside women who were 50, who had children your age, who had been at this company since before you were born. The Binghamton Clothing Company sat at 17 Wall Street, right along the Chenango River, in a building that had previously housed a cigar factory. It was 4 stories tall, and it made men's work overalls and jeans. The owner was a man named Reed B. Freeman, and by the standards of his time, he was considered one of the good ones. His wife worked the factory floor alongside the women he employed. He did not hire children, which put him apart from many factory owners of the era. His doors were not locked. And crucially, in the 2 years since a catastrophic fire at a garment factory in New York City had shaken the entire country and prompted factory owners across the state to rethink their practices, Freeman had instituted regular fire drills. The women of the Binghamton Clothing Company had practiced evacuating their building so many times that they could clear the whole structure in 20 seconds flat. Reed Freeman believed he was doing things right. He had every reason to think so. His building had been inspected. His practices were in line with what was expected of him. He was a man who worked alongside his wife in the factory he owned and ran fire drills that his workers had mastered. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that one single critical thing had never been tested. Not once. Not by him, not by the inspector, not by the fire marshal, not by any of the 100+ women who showed up to work there every day. And that one untested thing would cost 31 people their lives. The building at 17 Wall Street had a particular geography that on most days meant nothing at all. On July 22, 1913, it meant everything. It was a former cigar factory, which is to say it was a building designed for one industrial purpose and repurposed for another. The structure was 4 stories high, solid in the way that brick and timber construction of that era appeared solid, imposing from the street, the kind of building that felt permanent when you looked at it. Its north side faced out over Henry Street, near the new post office. The back of the building adjoined the McCallard Drug Company. The Chenango River ran at the far end of Wall Street, visible from the upper windows on a clear day. From the post office 80 feet away, the clerks and cashiers working their counters could hear the persistent drone of the sewing machines inside, all 5 banks of them running at full production from the moment the workday began. The floor plan was simple in a way that concealed its danger. There was a single main stairwell, a narrow interior passage that served as the only real route in or out for workers on the upper floors. There was an elevator shaft running through the building's core. And there were 2 small exterior fire ladders bolted to the outside of the structure, which existed on paper as the building's fire escapes. In the testimony that followed the fire, investigators established something that is still difficult to read more than a century later. Not Reed Freeman, not the building inspector Nash, not the fire marshal Eldridge, and not a single one of the workers inside that factory had ever actually exited through those ladders. The drills went down the main stairwell and out the front door. The ladders were bolted to the outside wall and they stayed there, untouched, unused, and entirely untested. They were a detail on an inspection form. They were never anything more than that on all 4 floors. Fabric scraps and piles of plush material, the raw stuff of the overalls they sewed every day, sat in corners and beneath machine stations. Ordinary. Unremarkable. State inspectors would later identify this as a direct hazard. Considerable quantities of inflammable material on every level of the building. At the time, nobody with the authority to order its removal had done so. By the summer of 1913, Binghamton was in the grip of a drought. The city's water pressure had been strained for weeks, and the fire department had been running at an elevated pace as dry conditions made the whole region more combustible. The 24 hours before July 22nd had been particularly demanding. The department had responded to 5 separate calls. On the morning of the 22nd itself, the thermometer mounted outside the Broome County Courthouse read 91 degrees before 11 o'clock. A steady wind was blowing in off the river, strong enough to feel like relief, but not strong enough to cool anything down. It simply moved the heat around. Inside the factory, all 111 workers who had come in for Tuesday's shift were at their stations by 10 in the morning. Every window had been thrown open, every door propped wide, in an attempt to draw some of that river breeze through the floors. It was not enough. The building was, as one worker later recalled, unusually hot even by the standards of a July afternoon. The women on the upper floors had shed their long woolen outer skirts, which they were required to wear in public but stripped off as a matter of habit once they were inside. Some were working in their underslips and aprons, hands moving fast, the piece rate count running in their heads with every stitch. There is a reason so many of them had removed those skirts that matters for what happens next, and it is not laziness. The fire drills Reed Freeman ran required the women to be presentable before going onto the street, which meant putting the skirts back on before leaving the building. On previous drills, when the women had come outside in their working clothes, men on Wall Street had called out at them, harassed them, made the whole exercise humiliating. The women found it degrading. So many of them had made a quiet, private decision. If the alarm rings again and I am not properly dressed, I will take a moment to put my skirt on before I go out. It was a decision that made every kind of human sense given what they had experienced. It was a decision that, on this particular afternoon, would cost some of them everything. Around 1 o'clock, a worker named Mrs. William Whitney noticed that the air inside the building felt stranger than usual, heavier even accounting for the heat. She said nothing to the workers upstairs. Around 2 o'clock, she caught the unmistakable smell of smoke somewhere on the lower levels. A quiet search began among some of the women on the 1st and 2nd floors. Most of the workers on the 3rd and 4th floors, heads down at their machines, knew nothing about any of this. The best available account of where the fire started places it in the basement, or near the base of the stairwell, where fabric scraps had accumulated. Whether it began from a carelessly discarded cigarette, as was widely believed, or from some other source, was never officially confirmed. What is known is what happened in the first seconds after it caught, because the building's own structure took over almost immediately. Every open window, every open door, the elevator shaft running straight up through the building's center, all of it combined to do exactly what fire needs to become catastrophic. With every opening acting as a draft, the flames were drawn upward with a force that outpaced anything a person could outrun on a staircase. The stairwell, the single interior stairwell, the only real way out for the women above the 2nd floor, caught fire. Within minutes of ignition, the route those women had used in every single drill was already gone. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the factory's fire alarm began to ring. And here is where something almost unbearable happened, the thing that has stayed at the center of this story for more than a century. The women heard it, and most of them, at least for those first critical seconds, did not move. They had heard that alarm so many times. They had practiced the evacuation until it was reflex. They knew the rhythm of the drill gong. What some of them did not register or registered too late was that this alarm was sounding continuously, without pause, which was different from the pattern they knew. Some noticed and moved immediately. Others reached for their woolen skirts first, because going outside without them was something they had privately decided not to do. A survivor later described a woman on the fourth floor who looked up when the alarm sounded and said she was not dressed to go outside and suggested they wait. The women around her hesitated. Some sat back down. The smoke did not wait. The fourth floor held 50 women that afternoon. In the time it took many of them to accept that this was not a drill, the wooden stairwell below them had caught. The fire was no longer below them. It was in the walls, in the shaft, in the structure that held everything up. Reed Freeman was on the lower floors when the fire became undeniable. He grabbed buckets of water and attempted to fight it himself alongside a cutter named Amber Fuller. They could not stop it. Freeman's wife screamed upward into the building, trying to reach the women above. Freeman pulled the main alarm and the continuous ring spread across all 4 floors. On the lower levels, workers who could smell the fire and reach the exits got out. Many on the first and second floors escaped, some with severe burns, some barely able to stand. A group of women, some with their clothing already alight, ran from the building and directly toward the Chenango River at the end of the street. They threw themselves in, but the stairwell connecting those lower floors to the third and fourth was by then impassable. Whether any of the upper floor workers reached the exterior ladders and found them usable is unclear from what survives of the historical record. What is clear is that for the women on the upper floors, the options that remained were the windows and whatever seconds they had left. Nellie Connor was working on the upper floors when the smoke came. Nellie had been with the Binghamton Clothing Company for 31 years, longer than some of the younger workers had been alive. She was the kind of presence on a shop floor that holds a community together, someone the younger women turned to instinctively, someone who knew the rhythms and the people of that factory with an intimacy built across 3 decades. When the alarm rang and the smoke thickened, Nellie did not hesitate. She began moving women toward whatever exits she could reach, clapping her hands in the fast, steady rhythm they all recognized from the drills, pushing them forward, calling out, keeping them moving. She got people out. She kept going back. They found her body at the 3rd floor landing. She was identified by her gold pocket watch, which the heat had fused shut, sealed at the moment it stopped. She was surrounded by the remains of 5 other women who had pressed close to her in those final minutes. She had not left. She had stayed until there was nowhere left to stay. Sidney Dimmock was the factory foreman. He had worked for Reed Freeman for 16 years and was trusted by everyone in the building. During the drills, Dimmock had always been downstairs clapping the pace, making sure no one fell behind. When the fire broke out, he did what he always had done. He moved people out. He carried 2 women from the building on his own body, brought them to safety on the street, turned around, and walked back into the fire. He went in a second time. He did not come out. The fire department was half a block away. There was a firemen's convention taking place in Binghamton that same day, which meant additional personnel were in the city. None of it was enough because the nearest company was already on a call across town when the alarm went out. By the time they reached Wall Street, the heat radiating from the building was so intense it had begun to singe their wooden ladders. The drought had left the hydrant pressure critically low. The hoses barely reached. Every window of the building was full of fire. They could not enter. They worked to keep the blaze from spreading to the surrounding structures, and they waited. By 4 o'clock, the walls had caved in. The roof had collapsed. 18 minutes after the alarm sounded, the building at 17 Wall Street was rubble, not a structure, not a salvageable ruin. A pile of ash and ember and twisted iron from the sewing machines, and somewhere inside it were the people who had not gotten out. The hours that followed the collapse were unlike anything Binghamton had experienced. Police, firefighters, and volunteers from across the city came to Wall Street and began going through the rubble with their hands, with tools, with whatever they had. What they were doing was not a rescue. Everyone present understood that. What they were doing was trying to bring people back to their families, and what they found in the debris made that impossible for most of them. Of the dead, only 10 could be identified with certainty. The rest had been in the fire long enough that identification by sight was not possible. Names were reconstructed from the employee registry, from what coworkers and families could say about who had been inside that day, from small personal effects fused into the ash, a pocket watch, a ring, a scrap of fabric that someone who loved the person wearing it recognized. The newspaper reported the following morning that the recovery teams had not been pulling out bodies. They had been pulling out pieces. 19 victims were buried together in a shared grave on a hillside at Spring Forest Cemetery, in a ring of unmarked individual stones surrounding a central headstone. The city paid for the burial. Families who could not afford separate funerals received help. Reed Freeman contributed. The grave is still there today, the stones sunken into the earth over more than a century. The copper plaque on the central marker turned green. It is tended. It is visited, it is not famous. The newspaper count conveyed the full scale and cold arithmetic. Of the 125 workers on the payroll, only 17 had been accounted for as entirely uninjured. 22 were in hospitals. Several survivors, the paper noted carefully, were in a state described as near insanity. The city went into mourning in a way that was visible, collective, and total. Thousands attended the funeral processions. The Binghamton Clothing Company had not been a peripheral place. Its workers lived on every street in the city, attended every church, sent their children to every school. The loss was everywhere at once. Reed Freeman did not leave. He did not deflect. He did not issue a statement citing inspections passed or regulations met. He said directly and publicly that he was responsible for what had happened. He began raising money for the bereaved families almost immediately and continued doing so for the rest of his life. The company never reopened. Freeman spent what remained of his years carrying the weight of that Tuesday afternoon. On a Saturday afternoon in March of 1911, a fire broke out on the upper floors of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Lower Manhattan. 146 workers died, most of them young immigrant women. The owners had locked the doors on some floors to prevent theft. The fire escapes were inadequate, and one collapsed entirely under the weight of workers trying to use it. The building had no sprinkler system. Workers with no other way out jumped from the upper floors. The fire was visible from the street and people below watched, unable to help. The outcry was enormous. New York State created the Factory Investigating Commission, led by State Senator Robert Wagner and Assemblyman Alfred E. Smith. Frances Perkins, who would later become the first woman to serve as United States Secretary of Labor, worked alongside the commission and described what Triangle had exposed as a torch that lighted up the industrial scene. The commission visited hundreds of factories, took testimony from workers and inspectors, and produced detailed recommendations. By 1912, the legislature had already passed amendments requiring automatic sprinklers and other fire protections in factories. The system was moving. And yet, in July of 1913, 31 people died in Binghamton. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, because the Binghamton Clothing Company was not Triangle. Reed Freeman had not locked his doors. He had not blocked the exits. He had employed no children. He had run drills. He was, by the standards of what was asked of a factory owner in 1913, more conscientious than most, and his workers still died. Binghamton exposed, with a precision that Triangle had not quite managed, the specific nature of the failure. Triangle was about owner malice and locked doors. Binghamton was about something more structural and therefore more alarming. It showed that a factory could satisfy every visible requirement, pass every inspection, and still be a trap. Because the fire escape no one ever used was not a locked door, it was a door that looked open. And the difference between a locked door and an untested one in a building on fire is no difference at all. The Factory Investigating Commission redirected its full attention to what had happened at 17 Wall Street, and the Binghamton fire became the second decisive pressure point that forced New York to move with genuine urgency. What followed was not incremental. Workers' compensation became law in New York, establishing for the first time the legal right of injured workers and the families of the dead to be compensated without having to sue in civil court and prove negligence, a process that almost no working-class immigrant family could realistically pursue. Mandatory fire escapes that were tested and functional became law. Automatic sprinkler systems were required in factories. Fire extinguishers became mandatory in every building. More inspectors were funded. Penalties for violations increased significantly. Beyond New York, the National Fire Protection Association created its Committee on Safety to Life in the same year. That committee's work eventually produced the Building Exits Code of 1927, the direct forefather of what is known today as NFPA 101, the Life Safety Code, a document that governs the design of exits and evacuation systems in buildings across the entire country. Every exit sign in every public building, every fire door, every evacuation route that has actually been walked and timed and verified, their existence traces back through a line of legislation that includes the lessons learned on Wall Street in 1913. The fire that most people have never heard of left its mark on the built environment that surrounds everyone today. George F. Johnson, whose Endicott Johnson shoe factories operated just a few miles from where the clothing company had stood, did not wait for legislation. He immediately began retrofitting his buildings with sprinkler systems and safety upgrades that went beyond what any law yet required. He had seen what happened in a building that lacked them. He did not need to be told twice. The core conclusion that came out of the Commission's investigation was not that Reed Freeman was a bad man. It was that the rules governing his building had not been precise enough, enforced consistently enough, or funded seriously enough to actually do what they were supposed to do. Triangle had been a warning, Binghamton confirmed that warning had not been fully heard, and that the cost of not hearing it would keep presenting itself until the laws changed, the inspections changed, and the gap between what safety looked like on paper and what it required in practice was finally, durably closed. The plaque on Wall Street in Binghamton today stands across from where the building once stood. The factory is long gone. In its place is the ordinary texture of a city block, the kind that gives no sign of what happened there unless you know to look. But the plaque carries 31 names, and those names are not abstractions. Nellie Teresa Connor, Sarah Doran, Ruth Button, Martha D. Burdick, Lena Marie Kennedy, Edith M. Chernoff, Sidney Dimmock, Hattie Freeman, who shared a surname with the man who owned the building, Mary Sullivan, 3 listed simply as unidentified because not even the registry could account for everyone. The plaque was installed in 2013, on the centennial of the fire. Sometime after that, it was vandalized and destroyed. The city's Parks Department replaced and reinstalled it in 2021. That a memorial to 31 working people needed to be rebuilt because someone had chosen to destroy it is its own kind of commentary on how history is held and released. At Spring Forest Cemetery, the shared grave on the hillside is still maintained and visited. The ring of individual stones around the central marker, each one for a person who could not be sent home to a family, has settled into the earth over more than a century. The copper plaque has turned the deep green of old metal left outside for a very long time. The site is cared for by people who make a deliberate choice to remember it. But it is not a place that most people know to visit. It is not in the standard telling of this country's labor history. Not the way Triangle is, not the way the great strikes and marches and courtroom battles are. Binghamton is the fire that came after the famous fire, and proved that the famous fire had not been enough. What makes this story matter is not simply that it was a tragedy. Tragedy has always been common. What makes it matter is the specific question it puts on the table. How does a building that has been inspected, whose owner has run drills, whose workers can evacuate in 20 seconds, still kill 31 people in 18 minutes? The answer is not complicated, but it is demanding. It happens when the distance between what safety looks like and what safety actually requires is left unclosed, when the fire escape is bolted to the wall and never walked, when the flammable material sits on every floor and nobody removes it, when the inspection confirms what exists instead of requiring what is needed. That gap is not a relic of the past. Every sprinkler head above you in a building today exists because fires like this one kept proving, at enormous cost, that it needed to be there. Every fire door, every lit exit sign, every tested evacuation drill that actually uses the secondary routes. These things exist because Binghamton and Triangle and the disasters of that era demonstrated with brutal consistency that good intentions are not infrastructure, and that a compliant building and a safe one are not always the same thing. Reed Freeman was not a villain. He believed in what he was doing, and he spent the rest of his life in grief for what it produced. Nellie Connor was not naive. She had worked that building for 31 years, and she stayed inside it to save the people she knew. Sidney Dimmock went back in twice. These were not people who lacked courage or conscience. They were people inside a system that had not yet been built well enough to protect them, and the space between where they were and where they needed to be was exactly the width of a fire escape that no one had ever actually used. The cause of the fire on July 22, 1913 was never officially determined. What caused the deaths was, and 112 years later, the answer has not changed. A repurposed building with 1 stairwell, 2 unwalked ladders, an open shaft, a drought, a wind off the river, and workers who had practiced the wrong version of surviving, not malice. A system that had not yet cost enough to become what it needed to be. 31 names on a plaque on Wall Street, a ring of stones on a hill, and in every building you walk into today, an inheritance from people whose names you were never taught.